This statue of Queen Victoria stands at the entrance to the Royal Victoria Hospital, Belfast. The hospital was built nearly 100 years ago and named after the monarch who had reigned for over 60 years in the 19th century. But Victoria was much more than just Queen of England. Her full title was Queen of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, Empress of India. And her authority extended over all the countries that made up the British Empire. Most impressive. At its height, the British Empire was the largest that the world had ever seen. The empire was made up of lots of different countries in all 5 continents that were known as colonies. People of every race and nationality found themselves living under British rule in the different colonies. The empire covered so much of the globe that it was said to be an empire on which the sun never set. Ireland was part of this mighty empire, but was much more than just an overseas colony. Ireland was part of what was then known as the Mother Country, ruled by Queen Victoria. In Victorian times, all 32 counties of Ireland were ruled directly from London. Counties Antrim and Down, Cork and Kerry, along with all the others, were firmly part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. It had been like this since 1801, when the Act of Union became law and Ireland was integrated with the British political system. Under that system, members of Parliament from all over Ireland sat in the House of Commons and Irish peers sat in the House of Lords. The Church of England was united with the Church of Ireland, and there was free trade between Ireland and the rest of Great Britain. Before the Act of Union, Ireland had its own parliament for about 400 years. In the 18th century, it met here, in this magnificent building in the centre of Dublin, which now houses the Bank of Ireland. This is the mace that was used to symbolise the authority of the old Irish House of Lords. The Irish Lords used to meet here in this room, which contains 2 tapestries, which show 2 great events that are still commemorated by Irish Protestants today. One shows the Protestant King William of Orange urging his troops on to victory at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. The other shows his father-in-law, the Catholic King James, outside the city of Londonderry during the famous siege of 1689. For over 100 years after the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, members of the Irish Parliament were nearly all rich, influential landowners, descended from English families who came here in the 17th century to settle on land formerly owned by the native Irish. Most were Protestant by religion and indeed saw fit to rule Ireland in the Protestant interest, despite the fact that the majority of Irish people were Roman Catholic. Both Catholics and Protestants saw themselves as Irish, but in very different ways. And these different attitudes were to become very important in the crisis that developed in Ireland in the latter part of the 19th century. The crisis was about whether Ireland should be ruled from Dublin or London, and has affected the lives of British and Irish people ever since. It's come to be known as the Home Rule Crisis. The British mother country was made up of 4 quite distinct countries: England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. Their national flags were combined to form a new Union flag, or Union Jack. Elected representatives were sent from all 4 countries to serve as members of Parliament in the House of Commons at Westminster in the capital London. The numbers of MPs reflected the size of each country's population. Then as now, England was the largest and most dominant of these 4 countries. In 1881, a census was taken to establish exactly how many people were living in the different parts of the British Isles. In that year, Queen Victoria had been on the throne for 44 years. In 1881, over 24 million people lived in England. It was the world's most advanced industrialized nation, and increasing numbers of people were living in the towns and cities. Ireland had a population of about 5.5 million people. The total had dropped from 8.5 million since the Great Potato Famine of the 1840s. Scotland had a population of 3.7 million. The majority lived in the lowlands near the cities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. Wales had a population of 1.5 million. Most still lived in the countryside, but its coal mines were an important source of power for Victorian factories. All over the British Isles, contrasts were sharp between the country and the city, rich and poor. It was in Ireland that these contrasts were most marked, and it was in Ireland that they had the most profound political effect. During the 1840s, disease destroyed the crops of potatoes, the main food of half the Irish people. 1 million died of starvation, and another 1 million left Ireland forever to emigrate to Britain, America, and beyond. Many Irish nationalists blamed England for the catastrophe and wanted nothing more to do with Britain or her empire. Irish nationalists believed that all of the inhabitants of the island of Ireland were one people. They looked forward to the day when Ireland would have its own government in Dublin. Some nationalist leaders hoped that they could achieve their aims by peaceful means. Daniel O'Connell was born into a Catholic landed family in County Kerry. Strongly against methods of violence, he led a successful popular campaign to get emancipation. That is, the right of Catholics to become members of Parliament in 1829. He failed to get the Act of Union repealed in the 1830s and 1840s. Isaac Butt was a Donegal-born Protestant who became a lawyer, professor of politics at Trinity College Dublin, and in 1852, a Conservative Member of Parliament. In 1870, he launched the Home Rule movement to get Ireland a Parliament of her own in Dublin, but without leaving the British Empire. Charles Stewart Parnell was a Protestant landlord from County Wicklow. Elected Home Rule MP for Meath in 1875, he created the Irish Parliamentary Party and became its leader in 1880. At different times in the 19th century, these leaders represented the opinions of the majority of Irish nationalists, who favoured gradual change through the British parliamentary system. But others wanted to break the link with Britain completely and believed in revolutionary change using violence if necessary. Thomas Davis from Mallow, County Cork, became the leader of the Young Ireland movement in the 1840s. He founded the Nation newspaper in 1842. John Mitchell was the son of a Presbyterian minister from Dungiven, County Derry. He was arrested just before the armed rebellion of 1848 and sentenced to 14 years imprisonment in Tasmania, which was then known as Van Diemen's Land. He escaped, lived in America, and returned to Ireland in 1874 and was elected MP for Tipperary. James Stephens and John O'Mahony founded the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB, in 1858. Members of the IRB became known as Fenians, the name being derived from the Fianna, or Army of Finn McCool in the old Irish stories. The Fenians recruited members in Ireland and among Irish immigrant communities in Britain and the United States. They collected money for weapons and rose in rebellion against British rule in Ireland in 1867. The rebellion was easily suppressed, and those captured were tried and imprisoned. Nevertheless, many Fenians were to exert an important influence on the development of Irish history during the next 50 years. Irish nationalists felt a very strong feeling of grievance against the British. And these feelings were strongest amongst the poor. Many in the countryside still led lives of wretched poverty. The land that they worked was often poor itself, and the farms too small. Little wonder they resented paying rents they could hardly afford to those who seemed to represent British authority in Ireland. Much of the land was divided into great estates and then subdivided to be rented out to tenant farmers. Failure to pay the rent could result in tenants being thrown off their land. This was called eviction. Evictions caused great resentment among the poor. Police and military were often called out to protect the bailiffs from angry crowds. Sometimes, tenants refused to leave and families would barricade themselves inside their houses. If that happened, bailiffs would have to use battering rams to break down the walls. The owners or landlords of these estates lived in fine mansions like Castletown House near Selbridge, County Kildare. Some landlords were very rich, with their lifestyles being paid for by the rents charged to the tenant farmers. Most people in the countryside didn't live in a splendid big house, but had to be content with a much more humble cottage, like this one. In some of the poorest areas, the family might have to share their cottage with pigs and cows. It must have been pretty cramped in a place like this. Pretty smelly too. The stark differences between the lives of the rich landlord and the poor tenant led to widespread resentment. Michael David was a member of the IRB. He lost his right arm in a Lancashire mill accident as a child. In 1879, he founded a new group called the Land League. The slogan of the new group was Land for the People, and its aim was to fight on the side of small tenant farmers. Charles Stewart Parnell was the leader of the Irish Parliamentary Party, which promoted Home Rule. Parnell also saw the importance of the Land League and that the demands of the tenant farmers to own their land was tied to the national question. He became the president of the Land League. The activities of the Land League were to become central to the Irish nationalist cause. New tactics were adopted to shun any landlord who tried to rent out the holding of an evicted farmer. It was called boycott, after a Captain Boycott, agent for Lord Ern's estate near Lochmask, County Mayo. No one would work for Captain Boycott to lift his potatoes or thresh his corn until 50 Protestant labourers from Cavan and Monaghan volunteered to go to his assistance. It took 7,000 troops to protect the Orangemen, and in the end it cost £10,000 to save his crops. It would clearly cost far too much to rescue every landlord in Ireland faced with a boycott. Landlords and their agents were also under threat of physical violence. In September 1880, Lord Mountmorris was ambushed and shot dead by gunmen in County Galway. The Connaught Telegraph reported that local people were reluctant to help the authorities apprehend the killers. Extreme nationalist violence also erupted in Dublin in 1882, when the new Chief Secretary in Ireland, Lord Frederick Cavendish, was assassinated in the Phoenix Park, along with his Undersecretary, T.H. Burke. The killers belonged to a secret society known as the Invincibles. Their actions threatened the prospects for any peaceful change in Ireland. William Ewart Gladstone was the politician charged with the responsibility for finding a solution to the problems in Ireland. Gladstone was a Member of Parliament from 1832 onwards. He was Liberal Prime Minister for 4 separate periods. He disestablished the Church of Ireland in 1869, passed Irish Land Acts in 1870 and 1881, and promoted the first 2 Home Rule Bills of 1886 and 1893. Gladstone's mission was to pacify Ireland. At first he gave more power to the police, but this only made things worse. Then he put through the Land Acts. From now on, landlords were prevented from evicting tenants providing their rents had been paid, and land courts reduced the level of rents. These acts gave many tenant farmers what they'd always wanted. The way was now clear for Gladstone to introduce the first Home Rule Bill. There was only one stumbling block: Ulster. Ever since the plantation of Ulster by Scots and English settlers in the 17th century, Ulster had been different from the rest of Ireland. The plantation introduced a sizable Protestant population into what until then had been a Catholic country. In time, these Protestants were to become the majority community. In the late 18th century, Northern Presbyterians had been prominent in the formation of the United Irish movement. Many of these Protestant United Irishmen from Antrim and down took part in the 1798 rebellion against the British Crown. The rebellion came in the middle of a long war with France, and Britain was worried that Napoleon would land his troops in Ireland. In 1801, the Act of Union was passed, partly to eliminate this threat by controlling Irish affairs from London. Just over 80 years later, the Ulster Protestant community was firmly wedded to the cause of unionism. Unionism was a movement that supported the 1801 Act of Union between Great Britain and Ireland. It gained strength during the Home Rule Bills of 1886 and 1893, when Liberals and Conservatives supporting the Union came together, calling themselves Unionists. In Ulster, Unionism was closely associated with the Orange Order, an organisation that aimed to defend Protestant interests. Unionists gave their wholehearted allegiance to the cause of the Crown and the Empire. During the 19th century, North East Ulster developed differently from the rest of Ireland. Belfast was already a larger city than Dublin and was now one of the great ports of the British Empire. Its prosperity was based on heavy industry that gave it the appearance of a city in England or Scotland. In Harland and Wolff, Belfast had the largest shipyard in the world. The Queen's Island Yard made passenger vessels for the White Star Line to profit from the rapidly growing passenger trade across the Atlantic Ocean to America. Building these ships was a tough and painstaking business, but these skilled tradesmen took great pride in their work and saw themselves as an elite workforce. They were, in the main, predominantly Protestant, and with their livelihood connected to the wider trade and commerce of the empire, were inclined to support the link with Britain. Parts of Belfast were dominated by large linen mills. Ulster had become the greatest centre for linen production in the world, and thousands of men, women and children worked in these mills spinning and weaving linen cloth. Water from streams like the Blackstaff and the Farset that ran down from the hills behind Belfast provided the steam power that drove the heavy mill machinery, and it was around these streams that the mills were built. Industry in Belfast was thriving, but many working people still lived in conditions of extreme poverty. The people living in these areas shared a hard life as they struggled to make a living. But politically, they were still divided over the issue of Home Rule. Catholic nationalists living on the Falls saw themselves as Irish, so they were for Home Rule. But Protestant Unionists living on the Shankill saw themselves as British, and they were most definitely against it. Today, Belfast is still a city divided unto itself, and this formidable barrier seems to symbolise all that divides Catholic nationalist from Protestant Unionist. Today's peace line actually follows the underground course of the River Farset, the river that gave Belfast its name, and which was right at the heart of the Northern Industrial Revolution. It was here in the 1880s, in what is now a dilapidated borderland between two hard-pressed communities, where the conflict over Home Rule erupted into extreme physical violence. These two communities are still bitterly divided on how this part of the island of Ireland should be governed. Here, the conflict over Home Rule lingers on.